The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our 11 a.m. Commonwealth Purchasing Group webinar with First Data. I'm Phil Dubois, Member Resource Consultant here at Commonwealth Purchasing Group. For those of you that are unfamiliar with our program, CPG is the leading group purchasing organization for community health centers and other nonprofit organizations nationwide. Here at CPG, we negotiate savings and superior service from a portfolio of more than 75 nationally recognized vendors. Our members save over $30 million annually by utilizing our vendor contracts. Today we're excited to have Jeff Houghton, Senior Account Executive at First Data, lead our discussion on mitigating patient payment fraud with EMV chip card technology. First Data is the global leader in electronic payment solutions. First Data Corporation makes it easier for your organization to accelerate cash flow, reduce costs, and eliminate risks associated with check and cash handling. We'd like to have this webinar be discussion-based, so please feel free to raise your hand or type a question into the chat section at any time. After the presentation, we plan to stay on for an additional 30 minutes to answer any questions that you may have for Jeff and the team on the webinar today. Jeff, thank you for being here today. Let's jump right into the presentation.
Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the invitation to speak today, and it's a pleasure being here. As Phil said, my name is Jeff Houghton. I am a senior business consultant with First Data. I have been with the company for more than 15 years and have had the pleasure of supporting the First Data Commonwealth Purchasing Group partnership for the last 7 years. Throughout those 7 years, I've successfully brought many CPG members on board the program with an enabling multitude and bringing a lot of savings to the table. For today's session, however, I am going to be speaking directly about EMV. By the end of the presentation, you should have a much better understanding of what EMV is, the effects it's had on our industry, and some of the First Data solutions available to you as you transition to EMV. So EMV, what exactly is it? Well, the credit card that you have in your wallet today more than likely has a chip on it, and that chip is EMV. EMV, it stands for EuroPay, MasterCard, and Visa. And between these three card brands, they came together with the common objective of attempting to reduce the high rate of counterfeit card fraud plaguing the industry. Although new to the US, however, it's actually been in existence for many years. It was actually introduced back in 1994, to be exact. So how would they achieve this objective? Well, they understood that the data on the card swipe could be easily duplicated. So they actually needed to come up with a way to improve security on the consumer card. And this is where the security chip was introduced and EMV was eventually born. EMV is now the global standard for the card payment processing throughout the globe. The next slide provides a snapshot of some key points I'd like to bring to everyone's attention this morning. Again, as previously stated, EMV technology had been around since 1994. 2.37 billion chip cards issued worldwide and are accepted and proven among many merchants and banks in more than 130 countries. The US, unfortunately, is one of the last developed countries in the world to adapt to the card chip technology. And as a result of this delayed response, the US has reported almost half the world's credit card fraud in 2013. Data breaches are increasing constantly, and almost 2 million data records are stolen every day, equivalent to 23 records every second. If the US had adopted EMV along with our European counterparts, EMV would have protected our consumers and businesses, and it would not have had such an impact on US processing activity. The next slide, while the rest of the world has become more secure, payment card fraud on the US is on the rise. Back in 2013, the US accounted for a little over 23% of the global payment card volume, although in the same year, the US accounted for a little over 47% of the global payment card fraud. Reason being that the criminal organizations were focusing more on the US market because the US had not adopted EMV at that point. So for the past 5 years then, the US has earned the distinction as being the #1 country in incidence of card fraud, which I suppose is nothing to be proud of. Some other staggering statistics to be aware of. So again, back in 2013, $8.6 billion was the estimated total cost of fraud per year in the US. Out of that 8.6 billion, 32% of the 8.6 billion was attributed to counterfeit cards. Now, if EMV was in place, the gurus have statistics where they state that 90% of the 32% would have been immediately avoided if EMV was being utilized within the US market. So these numbers alone were obviously reasons why EMV needed to be accelerated into the US market. The next slide gives you some idea of the roadmap of how EMV actually got introduced into the US. Again, from our previous slide, we did state that it was 1994 where EMV first came into play, but it wasn't until 2011 when Visa and MasterCard started to decide on introducing EMV to the US market. But it wasn't until 2013 when they decided they needed to accelerate their idea, and this was really attributed to the target reach. And because of the multitude of cards compromised and the cost of that breach, Visa and MasterCard decided to rapidly bring the EMV idea, and their goal was to implement it last year, being October 1 of 2015. So what exactly has been the impact of this? Well, so how is Visa and MasterCard going to roll out, or what was their intention and plan to roll out this idea of EMV into the US market? Well, they first decided against a mandate of forcing merchants to adopt EMV. And what they decided to do was to make a ability shift to merchants. So basically, prior to October 1 of 2015, if a health center was to receive a chargeback against them, what would happen was that the health center would receive what's termed a retrieval request, informing them of the chargeback, and then the health center would have up to 10 business days to respond to the chargeback. Once their processor received the health center's response, the processor would then send that merchant response back to the issuer of the card, and the issuer was ultimately responsible for deciding who was responsible for the chargeback. So that's how chargebacks were handled prior to October 1 of last year. Post October 1, what happens is that if a merchant, if a health center was not EMV ready, i.e. they did not have a terminal or POS system that could accept cards that could read the chip information, if they received a chargeback on that card, they would lose the retrieval request opportunity, and they would automatically be guilty of the chargeback. So what's been happening is, so obviously I've had a couple of months to, recognize what's happened in the market, since the implementation of EMV. And what I've noticed is that the criminals and the not so honorable people out there, they're actually looking now for merchants that don't take EMV transactions. And as soon as they identify those merchants, health centers, etc., they're actually, they identify them, and then they're going in using their card and then immediately initiating a chargeback for that transaction. And then the merchant, if they don't have technology to read the chip, they have no way of contesting the chargeback. So this is basically how Visa and MasterCard decided to go to market on this. Yes, obviously every merchant had to incur an additional cost to implement the program, so it was not a mandate, but with these chargeback rulings, I feel that every merchant really needs to make the investment and adopt EMV. So in summary, what does the merchant or the health center need to do? First of all, they need to have an EMV compliant terminal, a terminal that can read chips and is also responsible for working with their processor to ensure that their terminal can accept EMV transactions. Now, it's important to note, ladies and gentlemen, that the processor, not all processors today are compliant. So it's important to be working with a processor like a First Data, being the leader in the industry, that is an EMV compliant processor. We actually deploy our own branded terminals, and that's what gives us great ownership on the rollout of EMV to our merchants. Also then, the issuer, it has a responsibility. If an issuer decided not to upgrade the card holders to an EMV chip card, they would then be held responsible for any fraudulent duplication of cards. So you will have noticed then in your wallet that more than likely your card has now been updated to an EMV card. The next slide basically gives you an example of what a chip EMV card looks like. The fraud-preventing microchips can reside inside a payment card or on a mobile device. The chip technology greatly reduces a criminal's ability to create counterfeit cards by introducing a dynamic value. What this dynamic value is that before the credit card information on a card swipe was, once it was stolen by the criminals, it was very easy to, once they got the information on the card, it was very easy to duplicate it and use it across the spectrum. But now what happens is that once an EMV chip card is used at a merchant location, it immediately creates a dynamic value, and that's what differentiates the card from the old credit card with the magnetic strip. So the next slide basically gives you a broad summary of how to process a card. Or again, how do you use an EMV card to make a purchase? So just like magnetic strip cards, EMV cards are processed for payment in two steps: card reading and transaction verification. However, with EMV cards, you no longer have to master a quick, fluid card swipe in the right direction. Chip cards are read in a different way. Instead of going to a register and swiping your card, you are going to do what is called card dipping instead, which means inserting your card into a terminal slot and waiting for it to process. When an EMV card is dipped, data flows between the card chip and the issuing financial institution to verify the card's legitimacy and create the unique transaction data. This process isn't as quick as a magnetic strip swipe, but it will take a tiny bit longer for that transmission of data to happen. But if a person just sticks the card in and pulls it out, the transaction will likely be declined. So please note, it's a little bit of patience will be involved in adopting the EMV process. So EMV and First Data. Obviously, First Data, we are the global leader in credit card processing. We process about 55% of all the credit cards in the world. In 2015, First Data's global platform processed a little over 35 million US-based merchant EMV transactions. And currently, First Data's global platform issuing business processes over 2 billion EMV transactions. Not only is First Data an acquirer of accepting credit cards, but we also are on the issuing side as well, where we are actually in the market of designing and creating those chip cards for many issuing banks, which makes us basically the leader in this technology. Again, thank you for your time in joining me today for this morning's call. If I could kindly hand the call back over to Phil, and if you could open the call for any questions, I'll be more than delighted to take any questions that anyone may have.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff. Really appreciate your time here with us this morning. At this time, as Jeff said, and I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, feel free to use the raise your hand feature and we'll unmute your line. Otherwise, you could chat directly on the panel to the right side of your screen and send us your questions and we'll be more than happy to answer those. Just an important note here, we are recording this webinar. The recording will be emailed to you within a day or two. It will also be on our website within a day or two, and we'll be sending the presentation over to you in PowerPoint format so that it can be forwarded as necessary to colleagues at your organizations. As well as Jeff and my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us directly if there are questions that come up afterwards. Looks like for the time being, we don't have questions flowing in. So Jeff, thank you so much for being with us here this morning. We really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it, and thanks again, Phil, for the opportunity to speak to everyone on this morning's call.
Great. Thank you very much. Hope you all have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.